In this video, I'm going to show you how to code this recipe card using HTML and CSS. So let's begin. Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Adi Purdila. And if you remember last week's video, we designed a very simple recipe card in Figma. And as promised in this week's video, we're going to take that design and we're going to code it with HTML and CSS. And in the video description, you'll find links to all of the resources that I'm using in this video, as well as a link to a code pen where you can find the code that we're going to be writing for this very simple card. So I think we should just get started. Now, to remind you, this is the card that we designed last week. Very simple. We have basically an image, some meta information here, and a title. And if you didn't see that video, you'll find a link to it down below, and you'll also find a link to this Figma file that you can download for free and use it in your own projects if you so desire. Now, in terms of coding for this tutorial, I'm going to be coding locally. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code as my editor of choice. And we're going to do things the old-fashioned way. I'm going to preview things in Safari. And I already set up a small project here. I have an index HTML and a style CSS that's currently blank. And inside the index HTML, I just added or loaded a reset file called modern normalize. This is the one that I prefer using as a reset. And a reset file basically sets up your project in such a way that you're starting with a clean slate every time. It like resets the margin padding on the body. It sets, in this particular file, it sets the box sizing to border box. So basically, it ensures that you're starting your project with a style sheet that makes or styles your elements to look pretty much the same on all browsers. That's the purpose of a reset file. It irons out those inconsistencies that you can sometimes find between browsers, and also adds like the very usual styles that you would normally have to write yourself, like resetting the margins for the body and the paddings and stuff like that. Basically, check out Modern Normalize here on GitHub. This is a fantastic library. It's free. You can use it on both personal and commercial projects. So that's a great place to start. So I have that loaded up here, and I also have a link to my style.css. All right, so let's get started with the markup for our card. To be able to write the markup properly, let's take a closer look at our design here. So first of all, obviously we need to define a container for our card. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to call this recipe card. And what I like to do here is add an end comment after each div, where I just write end dot recipe card. If I'm using a class here, or if I'm using an ID, I'm going to type in the name of the ID. And this just helps me see where certain divs are ending, and it just makes the whole coding process a little bit better, for me at least. Next, we have an image, right? And this image actually needs to behave sort of like a background, because as you can see, when we resize our card here, the image is sort of like a background image. In this case, it's not like a static image, which will just get bigger or smaller. So we need to replicate this functionality. And to do that, I'm not going to just put an image here and be done with it. I'm actually going to wrap it inside a figure. So figure, and inside, I'm going to use an IMG. For the image, I actually forgot to download this, but you'll find a link to this photo. It's the same one that we used in the previous tutorial. So I'm going to download a small version because I think that's more than enough for this project. All right, so I just dragged that into my my working folder here, and I'm gonna call this, I'm actually gonna rename it to card image.jpg. All right, so let's go ahead and load that up. Card image JPEG, and for alt, I'm just gonna say card image. All right, next we have this kind of meta information that contains a dish type and also the statistics. And for this, we're going to use a paragraph, which we're going to style to give it this nice border. And for these, we're going to be using an unordered list. So let's go ahead and write that. We're going to say div class card meta. And I'm going to end this again, end card meta. And inside, I'm going to add a paragraph with a class of dish type. And I'm going to say dessert. And then under that, I'm going to define a UL with a class of dish stats. And inside, two list items, which the first one is going to say 2.5 hours. And the next one is going to say 237. We'll worry about these icons in just a little bit. For now, let's focus on finishing up the markup. And then finally, under the card meta, we just have the title, for which we're going to use an H1, and we're going to paste that in. And that should do it, really. Let's have a look inside here. Refresh. And this is our starting point. The markup that we wrote currently looks like this in the browser, with only the modern normalize style applied to it. All right, so now let's begin styling our card. So I'm going to open up my style CSS, and I'm going to start by defining some presentation styles. These are just for the demo. They really have nothing to do with the card itself. I'm going to start by setting a background color, and I'm going to be picking up this color here. And I'm going to set a display to flex, because I want to align this card to the middle of the screen. I'm going to give it a height of 100 VH, or viewport height, so that we can do the vertical alignment properly. And then to align, I'm just going to say align item center and justify content center. And that will center our card right in the middle. Of course, now it's a little bit too big, and it's a little bit bigger than the viewport height, but we'll fix that in just a little bit. Now, for this demo, I'm actually going to use some CSS variables. So let's go ahead and define those right here. And I'm going to define them in the root pseudo class, so they're globally available. First of all, I'm going to define a card BG color. That's going to be white. I'm going to define a card text color. And for that, we're going to be using 0705. And what else? Let's also define the dish type color. That's going to be this bit right here, BB5274. We also have a radius that's applied to both the image and the card, and that radius is 16 pixels. So let's go ahead and define that. We'll define it as global radius. And finally, what I want to define here is a card shadow. Now, for the card shadow, if you remember from last week's video, we applied a very fancy shadow to this card, and it's not just one shadow. It's actually a few layers of shadows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers. And I did that with a plugin, with a Figma plugin called Shadows. Now, if we go to this website, bron.af/shadows, it's actually the creator of the Figma plugin. And you can generate those shadows from here as well, and you can use them in CSS, right? So what I'm going to do, this is the default shadow that I also used in the design. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to jump back here, and I'm just going to use the shadow value like so. And I'm gonna place these values into the card shadow variable. And CSS variables, as you might know, accept multiple values like this. All right, and that's pretty much it for the CSS variables that we're gonna need. Now let's focus on the actual recipe card. So recipe card, I'm gonna start by defining the background color. And I'm gonna be using a variable, and that will be card bg color. I'm also gonna define the box shadow. Again, var card shadow. And I'm also going to define the border radius. Var global radius. Let's also define the color of the text. And let's give it a width. Now for the width, this is 340 pixels. I want to convert that to rems. And to do that, I need to divide 340 by the base font size in our document, which is 16 pixels. So 340 divided by 16 gives us 21.25. We're going to round that off to 22 rems. So we're going to save that. And now we have some progress. So the card is now the correct width. I set up the card background, shadow, and also the color of the text. And since we're writing the CSS for the card, let's also define the font or load the font that we're going to use. And if you remember, we used Poppins, which is a free font available from Google. So if we open up Google Fonts and we search for Poppins, we're going to select a couple of styles. We don't need all of them because it's just going to make our page load a little bit slower. So we're going to need the regular, and we're going to need the semi-bold, and also the bold. So once you select all of these, you can just copy the link from here, and we can paste that in our HTML file right here. And then in our style.css, all you got to do is copy this declaration. That will set up the font family as Poppins. So now we are using the correct typeface. Let's also set up a line height of 1.5. And that's going to give us the proper line height for our typography. All right, now let's see about this image. What do we do with it? Because currently it kind of overflows our card. It's not the correct size, and it definitely doesn't act like a background image like we originally intended. So to fix that, let's start with the following. A recipe card, and I'm going to target the figure element, and I'm going to set a width to 100% of its parent. I'm going to reset its margin just in case it's not reset by the normalize file. And let's also set up its height. So for the height, if we take a look here, it's 222. If we divide this by 16, it gives us 13.875, and we'll round that off to 14 rems. All right, let's take a closer look. Okay, so now our image is starting to fall in line here, but it still overflows its parent element, which is the figure. So to fix that, I'm going to set overflow to hidden. So now we can just see a little part of the image, but I don't want to see this little part of the image. I want the image to kind of resize and reposition itself as I'm making this card container bigger or smaller. So for that, I'm going to target recipe card, figure IMG, and inside I'm going to set a width to 100%, a height to 100%, and check this out. I'm going to say object fit cover. Now let's take a look at what that is doing. Ta-da! Pretty cool, right? Now you'll see that if I change, for example, the width of my card, look at how the image is behaving. See? It's kind of repositioning and resizing itself, and it behaves like a background image, which is pretty cool. So let's bring this back. Object fit, in case you don't know, here's what it's doing. It specifies how the contents of a replaced element should be scaled relative to the box established by its used height and width. And if we check out the MDN reference, let's go ahead and copy that link. And as you can see, there are some different values here. This is what the fill looks like, contain, and the one we're interested in is cover. And you can read more about this, this property on the MDN or the Mozilla Developer Network. Now, we're almost done with the image. The last thing we need to do is basically round off these two corners, because the recipe card does have that border radius, but at the top, it's obscured by this image. So to fix it, we'll go to the figure and we're going to say border radius. And we don't want to apply the radius to all four corners. We just want the top left and top right. So for that, we're going to say var global radius, and let's go ahead and copy this. And we'll duplicate it and say 0, 0. This syntax basically tells the browser to use the new global radius on the top left, top right, but not on the bottom right and the bottom left. Okay, here I just set these values to 0. And now, just like that, we have rounded corners on just two sides of our image. Perfect, let's move on. Now, if you remember from the Figma tutorial, we set a padding on these elements. And that padding is 32 pixels top bottom, 24 pixels left and right. So in other words, these elements are 32 pixels from the image and 32 from the bottom and 24, as you can see, from the sides. Now, because we wrote our HTML the way that we did, we can't really select all of these elements and apply a padding like we have here in the design. Instead, we're going to use margins to space out these elements. So first of all, we're going to apply a margin bottom to the image so that it pushes the content down. And that margin needs to be 32 pixels. So under the figure, we're going to say margin bottom 32 pixels, but we're going to use rem values, and 32 is 16 times 2. So that's 2 rems. Save that. And now you'll see that this is now pushed down. Let's also target the H1. So recipe card H1. And I'm going to add a margin bottom of 2 rems as well, just to push that or to create that spacing from the bottom. And let's also create the spacing on the sides. So for that, we can actually say margin left 24 pixels, that's 1.5 rems, and also margin right 1.5 rems. And it looks like this. But we can actually condense these three properties into a single one, and we can just say margin 0 on the top, 1.5 rems on the right, 2 rems on the bottom, and again 1.5 rems to the left. And that's going to do exactly the same thing. You saw a little change there because we also defined margin top to 0. Now let's also add the lateral distance for these elements. So I'm going to define here, or I'm going to reference the card meta, and I'm going to say margin, again 0 on the top, 1.5 rems to the bottom, and there is actually a little space between the title and the meta, 8 pixels, so that's 0.5 rems. We need to add that right here, so 0.5 rems. All right, so now in terms of spacing, everything is set up correctly. Now let's take care of this meta information here, and we're going to start with the dish type, right? I believe that's what I called it. Paragraph class dish type. So I'm going to say dish type. First of all, let's change its font weight because we're using semi-bold here. So font weight, semi-bold is 600. Let's also do a letter spacing. In our design, the letter spacing is set to -1%, but in CSS, we're going to say minus, let's say 0.25 pixels. That's going to get us like really close to what we have defined in our design. Let's change the color to white, and let's also reset the margin because it's a paragraph, and let's set the background color to var dish type color, and let's also set a padding. Let's see what kind of padding we're working with here. 4 pixels top bottom, 16 left right. So top bottom 4 pixels, that's 0.25 rems and 1 rem left and right. And finally, let's make it a pill shape. We're going to define the border radius as 100 pixels. So now refresh, and there it is. Now it's a little bit wider here, but we'll fix that in just a little bit when we're going to align these two elements. Next, let's take care of this of the dish stats. So dish stats, that's a list. So the first thing we'll do is list style none to get rid of the bullets. Let's reset the margin and padding like that. And let's set a display to flex because I want these to be aligned or displayed in a single row. And also in here, I'm going to set align items to center, so they're always going to be center aligned. Now, to place these, the dish type and the stats on the same line, we're going to go back to the card meta, and we're going to do the following. Display flex, and that's going to place them like so. But we want the dessert to sit on the left side. We want the stats to sit on the right side. That means we need to define the justify content as space between. And this works really well for this type of situation because it's going to push these two elements to the sides, and it's going to set the space between them as the remaining space from the overall width of the parent. Finally, what we need to do here is set a font size, and I believe we used 12 or 13 pixels for this text. So let's do that. 13 pixels here. And now our card meta is properly aligned. The only thing that's missing is these, right? The little icons. And what I could do is simply go ahead and export these as SVGs, but I want to be able to control their color a little bit better. So what I'm going to do in Figma is select the actual element, right click, copy paste, copy as SVG. And now I'm going to jump back to my index.html, and I'm going to paste it right here in my list item. And then I'm going to do the same with the heart icon, copy, or right click, copy paste, copy as SVG. And I'm going to paste that in right here. So now, those two SVG files are rendered on my page. A couple of things that we need to do here. We need to properly align these with the text and apply some distance between them. So Back in my CSS, I'm going to say dish stats list item. So I'm targeting the individual list items. I'm going to set a display to flex in here as well. And I'm going to align items to the center. Let's check it out. Cool. So now, as you can see, the icons just fall in place right away with the text. And to add the spacing, first we need to add a margin left of 1 rem to the list items to separate these two. And let me quickly check the design in Figma to make sure that spacing is correct. And it is. And then we also need to add an 8 pixel distance between the icon and the text. And to do that, I can simply target the dish stats list item SVG, and I can say margin right 8 pixels, that's 0.5 rems. So now refresh, and there you go. Now, in terms of the color, if you remember from Figma, for the text, we're using our main text color with a 75% opacity. And for the SVGs, the icons, the same color with 25% opacity. So we're going to target the list item, and we're going to say opacity 75% or 0.75. It's exactly the same thing. And then to properly control the color of the SVGs, first we need to remove the stroke and stroke opacity properties from the SVGs, like so. And let me just clean up the code here a little bit. Okay. And then in style.css, I'm going to target dish stats list item SVG path, and we're going to say stroke, and I'm going to set that to var card text color, and I'm going to say stroke opacity 0.25. And it's going to do exactly the same, or it's going to give us exactly the same result, except I can now control the color of those SVGs. So if I want to change my card text color, for example, to, let's say, red, right? That's going to change the text color, but also the color of the icons, which is pretty cool. All right, what else? I think the only thing left to do here is to properly style this H1. So back in CSS, let's search for the H1 here, and we're going to say font size. We need to define that. It is 20 pixels, and we also need to set a negative letter spacing. So I'll say 20 pixels here. Letter spacing is going to be negative 1 pixel. And also let's set the font weight to bold, which is 700. And now we have a nice recipe card. And we can, change maybe the height of the image. This is what it looks like. Or we can change the width of the entire card. Let's make it a tad bigger. And as you can see, the image will just resize, reposition itself. It's going to act like a background image. And the rest of the elements, because we're using Flexbox, will just move to their correct position. All right, and there you have it, a very simple recipe card design coded with HTML and CSS. Now, this video was or is a bit longer than what I usually post on the channel, but I really wanted to cover every single detail of this coding process so we can hopefully understand it better. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I would love to hear from you. Also, you can download this code. You can get it for free from CodePen. You'll find a link in the video description. With that said, thank you very much for watching. Make sure to give it a thumbs up if you like this video and subscribe for more content like this. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care. Or using HTML and CSS. So let's get started. Let's get coding.